Hello everyone, and today we're going to go over Hannah Arendt's book, The Origins of Totalitarianism, Chapter 6, entitled Race Thinking Before Racism. Now, just looking at the title of the chapter, we see that Hannah Arendt identifies two things, race thinking and racism. Race thinking, according to Arendt, means having an opinion about the distinctions between races. Racism, on the other hand, takes those opinions and makes them into prejudices that are weaponized and used for political purposes against other races. Now, this is a little bit different than how we think about race today. Any kind of race thinking that distinguishes one race from another is oftentimes called racism. What Arendt is making the argument here for is that race thinking should be seen differently as racism. One, racism being something that is much less tolerable, but race thinking as something that could be held as a public opinion. According to Arendt, racism is an ideology, which means that it purports to hold the keys to the universe. Quote, "For an ideology differs from a simple opinion in that it claims to possess either the key to history or the solution for all the riddles of the universe, or the intimate knowledge of the hidden universal laws which are supposed to rule nature and man. Furthermore, fully fledged ideologies like racism can be used by political regimes in order to push their agenda, like the Nazis." Actually, according to Arendt, she makes the argument that the Nazis could calculate more support from racism than any kind of fifth columnist or underground organization in France. Ideologies are those concepts which, if they are not in alignment with the facts of the world, it's probably the world that's at fault and not the ideology. It seems that you need to twist the facts in order to make your ideology seem consistent and true, because that's what you want to believe. Ideologies become so infused in our thinking that they often become inconspicuous. You think of science as something that is completely objective and impersonal. However, who decides which science experiments are important comes with a bias. And this, according to Arendt, is what we see back in the 19th century. There was experiments in science to prove racial differences. But according to Arendt, it's not science's fault. People are going to use the tools available to them in order to push forward their own beliefs. What's dangerous about science is that it purports to take those beliefs and solidify them in the nature and the universal law. So again, we have race thinking and racism, and in order to understand what racism means, we have to first start with race thinking. So again, there's two things. There's race thinking and then there's racism. And racism comes out of the ideas of race thinking according to Arendt. So in order to understand racism, we must first go back and understand what it meant for people to think about race back in the 19th century. She does this in each of the sections of the chapters. She first starts with France, then goes to Germany, and then finally England. Before the French Revolution, there was a Orientalism that embellished different kinds of people. It was a time of humanity loving, as Arendt calls it. Herder is quoted as saying that the new specimens of humanity are something that we should be intrigued by, and it's something that we should love. Arendt says that during the French Revolution, this exoticism and the love for humanity was filled in the hearts of the French people. It's this distinguishing between races that led to a nation-building concept that it's kind of ironic in that it kind of turns out that in the end it becomes a nation-destroying subject. It's ironic that this humanity-loving, nation-building concept turned out to become a nation-destroying racism that we'll see later on. According to Arendt, race thinking started in France in the 18th century by the name of Comte de Boulevenir. I'm probably not pronouncing that right, so we're just going to call him B. He adhered to this philosophy that was known previously called might is right. What it says is that the people who are in power, who have the might, are who determine what is right and what is wrong. For B, the people who are mighty are the people who are conquestors. And this is how he framed the history of France. He reinterpreted French history as belonging to two different people. You have the Germanic noble people, who are the conquestors who took over the territory of France. And then you have the Gauls, or the Celtic bourgeoisie, which originally come from the Roman Empire. According to his doctrine, Germanic nobles, like himself, earned the power and authority over the Celtic bourgeoisie, or the common people, because they were the conquestors, and they took over the territory. Quote, "It is certain that in common right all men are equal. It was violence that introduced the distinctions of liberty and slavery, of nobility and third estate. But even though these have vicious origins, their practice has been established in the world for so long that they have acquired the force of a natural law. So note here he's saying that all people are equal. It's only violence or might that determines who is superior and who's inferior. It's also important to note that he's not talking about race. He's not talking about people born with a certain blood or race that determines whether they're superior or inferior. It's based upon a historical fact, that historical fact being, for B, conquest. Now, again, this is before the French Revolution, and it's kind of ironic because violence is what determines who has authority. The nobles were the ones who took over France, but during the French Revolution, it was the common people, the bourgeoisie, who rose up and kicked the nobles out. These superior nobles fled the region. Now, there was a common conception amongst these nobles that they were all from a Germanic origin, which is the reason why they were much more superior than anybody else. And when they all fled France, they tried to create an international group in order to keep that nobility alive. It was during this time that they decided that conquest couldn't have been the authority-given power that made them rulers of France. Instead, it must be something more unique, something like race. A notable Frenchman of the time, Comte de Montelosur, expressed his contempt for the people by saying, the new people risen from slaves, a mixture of all races and all times. Now, it's pretty curious that they would want to designate themselves as a certain type of people, a Germanic people. In Germany at this time, there was not really an idea of a unified German people. In fact, there were more than 300 states during this time in Germany, and it wasn't unified at all. Now, this is where we come to Germany, where France divided its people with race thinking between the Gauls and the Germanic in order to gain some kind of superiority. The Germans were in a different state. They were already divided, and they wanted to unify, so they used race thinking as a tool in order to unify the Germanic nation. It also didn't help that Germany was being constantly invaded at the time. Arendt says that the German racial consciousness in Germany didn't really come to be until the 1806 Prussian defeat by Napoleon. But how would they unify themselves? They didn't have a common history, they didn't have a common government they had adhered to, but they did have one thing. They had a common language, they had a common culture, they had a common way of being. Quote, "The organic doctrine of a history for which every race is separate, complete whole, was invented by men who needed ideological definitions of national unity as a substitute for political nationhood." So France could rally around their political beliefs, but Germany didn't have anything like that, so they needed something more ideological, something more like race. And this is what they did. According to Arendt, a naturalistic definition of what a people are is supposedly an outstanding characteristic of what it means to be German. But let's not get too far ahead of ourselves. This doesn't mean that they're racist. This just means that they distinguish themselves from the rest. Arendt also notes that since Germany used race to unify the country as a nation, it's often confused that nationalism is racism, but it's anything but the case. According to Arendt, where nationalism unifies a people under a common principle of solidarity and equality, racism is used as a way to divide people. In 1870, the German country finally unified under a single nation. And when this happened, you would think that race thinking would become obsolete. But this wasn't the case, according to Arendt. The race thinking actually gave a foundation for a later thing called racism, which we talked about before, and that started in the imperialistic era, starting in the late 19th century, early 20th century. But before we get there, let's talk about one more concept that was going on during this time. In Germany during this time, Romanticism was also becoming a very popular idea. Now, what is Romanticism? There's probably lots of definitions to it, but I'll say it like this. I believe it's a reaction to Enlightenment thinking, where Enlightenment thinking told the individual that by using their faculty of reason, they could understand truths in the universe. Romanticism was a reaction to this, where the truth was not out there in the universe, but the truth was inside in the individual. And it was up to the individual to perceive the truth and create their own worlds. Novalis, a early Germanic romantic poet, says, the world must be romanticized, wanting to bestow a high sense upon the common mysterious appearance upon the ordinary, the dignity of the unknown upon the well-known. So Romanticism, at least the way that Arendt is trying to portray it, is a conferring of value, some kind of mystical value, onto ordinary objects. And one of those ordinary objects can be people. Another one of those ordinary objects could be races, but according to Arendt, since Romanticism basically touched every single object it could, the fact that it also touched race thinking wasn't actually that significant. The more significant thing about Romanticism is that it placed importance on the individual and how they perceive things. What's important about Romanticism is that it places new importance on the individual. If the individual is the keeper of truth, then one's personality has a lot to do with how one sees oneself. And according to Arendt, Romanticism led to something called personality worship. The more interesting one's personality, the more socially accepted one was, the more great and genius one was. This idea of impersonality evolved into an idea German intellectuals introduced called innate personality, which means that personality isn't something that you develop over time, but personality is something that's given to you naturally at birth. In essence, personality is related to blood, which is related to race, which I think you can see where this is going. It wasn't long after that you started seeing people use this idea of innate personality to condemn Jews, who they said lacked an innate personality. Clemens Brentano introduced the word Philistine as the opposite of someone who has innate personality. And people who were labeled a Philistine was oftentimes the Jews, or French, or English. To recap about race thinking in Germany, we can think about two main lines of thinking. First, there's an insistence on tribal origin that unifies all the different German states into one unified nation. Second, and what the Romantics specify as innate personality, or also something called natural nobility. In a sense, innate personality redefined what it means to be a noble. Before, it was something that was passed down, but now nobles can be created through one's personality, which is given to you at birth. According to Arendt, it's these two ideas that combine to develop the full-fledged ideology of racism that we see during the imperialistic era. According to Arendt, this ideology of racism started in France, and it started specifically with a writer, Gobineau. Gobineau set off to legitimize racism through something he called scientific racist theory. He's also the one who came up with the idea of the Aryan race, which the Nazis would later use. In his essay on the inequality of the human races, he makes the argument that the fall and the rise of civilizations can be reduced or distilled down to a single reason or a single theory. In this theory, he states that the aristocrats or the nobles are the superior race, but there is a fall to civilization when the common people who are of mixed race rise up and take over. He makes the claim that it all started with the French Revolution, and then it will eventually get to Europe, and then it will get to the rest of the world, and he actually thinks that the human race will only survive around 12,000 years because of this takeover of the inferior races. Quote, "The fall of civilizations is due to a degeneration of race, and the decay of race is due to a mixture of blood. This implies that in every mixture, the lower race is always dominant." According to Arendt, what Gobineau was really looking for was an elite class. He couldn't find it in the aristocracy or the nobles because they got taken over by the bourgeoisie. He wanted to create a new class, hence the Aryan class. Gobineau drew two contradictory results out of the fall of the nobility of the French Revolution. The first was the decay of the human race. And the second was a formulation of a whole new elite or aristocracy. But he didn't leave to see his racial ideas in practical action. And what actually happened is that the new race aristocracy led to the destruction of humanity. The Nazis took his ideology of the Arion Blood and labeled themselves as the race elite. After talking about France and Germany, Arendt then goes to what race thinking was like in England. According to Arendt, the initial ideas of race thinking in England also happened during the time of the French Revolution. The English saw the French trying to give equality to all people, but that was against their initial motivation of a nation that was built on inequality itself. Irish statesman and philosopher Edmund Burke argued against the idea of giving equality to all, instead appealed to a different idea called inheritance. Quote, "It has been the uniform policy of our Constitution to claim and assert our liberties as an entailed inheritance derived above us from our forefathers, and to be transmitted to our posterity, as an estate specially belonging to the people of this kingdom, without any reference whatever to any other more general or prior right." The idea of inheritance is that you get your privileges or your equality from the family that you're a part of that builds over time. It's passed down. According to Arendt, inheritance was the ideological basis of the English nation. And Burke enlarged this idea to all people in England. So instead of the France's rights of man, he introduced the idea of the rights of the Englishman. Whereas in France, the racial differences was seen as an opportunity to educate and assimilate, in England it was seen as a problem that needed to be solved. The abolition of slavery caused a divide between people who were already antagonistic towards one another. The first doctrine that resulted from this conflict was something called polygenism. Polygenism denied any relationship between races. It said there was no natural connection between any of these two people. Quote, "The main achievement was the destruction of the idea of the natural law as the uniting link between all men and all peoples." But it's important to note that this doctrine didn't say that one was superior over the other, it just said that everyone was isolated. But polygenism was replaced by a new doctrine that came along called Darwinism. I think we're all a little bit familiar with Darwinism, but just to go over, Arendt says there's two main concepts of it. First, Darwinism claimed the survival of the fittest, which basically just means that the most mighty or the most strong will survive over time. But it also laid claim to the idea that inheritance is based on a natural law. Second, an invited idea of an unlimited progress that man can make, and this would later become eugenics. Now, the survival of the fittest didn't last very long, at least in the political realm, because it was decided that England as a power couldn't really hold on to its nations, even though it was the strongest. However, the idea of an increasing power of man over time through eugenics did last, and we can see that in the idea of Nazism. Even more so, we can see the idea that innate personality would allow for the idea of eugenics to come to fruition. If we had the right people give birth in the right way, we'd be able to design innate personalities. It was through this idea of designing people that a new idea came along, this idea being that we can design our elite, our nobility. And it's this idea of the Arion Blood that Nazis pursued. Quote, "It originated among middle-class writers and not the nobility, but it was born of the desire to extend the benefits of noble standards to all classes, and that it was nourished by true national feelings." Now, the Germans aren't the only ones who did this. According to Arendt, English also had the idea of Saxodom. But for Dilke, who at least hinted at this idea, it wasn't an ideology. Quote, "For Dilke, common origin, inheritance, grandeur of race were neither physical facts nor the key to history, but a much-needed guide in the present world, the only reliable link in a boundless space." This boundless space being England, with all of its colonies all around the world. England needed some kind of ideological unity in order to make its people feel like a single nation. So in all these countries, France, Germany, England, race thinking was never a tool for itself, but it was a tool in order to kind of expedite or sharpen the current political conflicts at that time. However, when the ideas of race thinking subsided, it was reincarnated by imperialism. Imperialism wanted a way to rationalize they're going out and subjugating other countries, and they adhered to the idea of racism in order to do this. And in the next chapter, we'll go a little bit more into how imperialism utilized racism in order to get what it wanted. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed chapter 6. We'll come to chapter 7 probably in a week. Okay, have a good day.